welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I'm your host, Christy Keating. In this podcast, we talk about it all, our parenting, our partnering, and our professional lives, because they are all a part of us, and we were never meant to do this alone. Hello, Heartful Parents. I am so happy to have you back for another episode of the Heartful Parent Podcast. And I'm really thrilled to introduce you this week to my friend and colleague, Jo Langford. Jo is a dad, a master's level therapist, an author, and a sex educator for tweens, teens, and parents. And he lives not too far from me in the Seattle area. For the last 20 years, he has worked, and you'll hear him say this in our podcast, but he's worked in the intersection of adolescence, sexuality, technology, and behavior, which, are some big areas that challenge parents. He speaks internationally using information, education, and humor to help parents and professionals increase their knowledge and self-confidence as a proactive defense against the unfortunate consequences that sometimes accompany teen sexuality, behavior, and development. You can find more about his work to promote healthy, positive, and safe sexual and social behavior at his website, which is beheroes.net. That'll be in the show notes. But today, Jo and I are digging into two books that he's written. They're both called Spare Me the Talk. One is for adolescents who identify as boys or male and is called Spare Me the Talk, a growing up safe and smart guide for boy-identified people and their parents. And the other one, as you might have guessed, is called Spare Me the Talk, a growing up safe and smart guide for girl-identified people and their parents. And it's the third edition. The new edition just came out on July 31st. And it is a phenomenal book that really is designed to hand to your kiddo to give them lots of accurate information about everything that they need to know between the ages, and Jo will share this in our interview, but between the ages of 12 and 22. The update is awesome. And in this conversation, we dig into how to use a book like this with our teens and adolescents, what you need to know about it, what it can do for your kids, and why the update is important. So even if you have the earlier version, why you need the new version. And it really, I love what Jo talks about in the book, and he's going to share all of that with you in today's interview. I hope it's valuable to you. I hope that you learn something both from our conversation and that you're able to get your hands on a copy of this book. Without further ado, Jo Langford. All right, Jo Langford. It's really good to have you on the podcast. I know you and I worked together before, but thank you for being here.
Anytime. Love working with you.
You and I have done a number of events together for a group here in Seattle. You spoke at the Safe Parenting Summit, which I was just so grateful for. So it's really a joy for me to have you on the podcast. Obviously, we're going to be talking about your two revised, updated, amended, awesome books that just came out. But I want to talk first, for those of you who don't know you, those listeners who don't know you, tell us who you are and what you do.
Okay. My name is Jo Langford. I'm a therapist, and I'm a sex educator and a tech educator and a dad here in Seattle. But I travel around internationally now, actually, talking to parents, other professionals around. My specialty is that intersection of sexuality, technology, and adolescence, and the messes that can happen when we smash those things together sometimes. That's my weird wheelhouse.
But I love the way you put that, the messes that can happen when we smash them together. Adolescence, technology, and sexuality is, as you well know, such a challenging space for parents to live in and parent in. And so I love that there are awesome people like you doing work in this space to help all of us. every time we talk, I learn something from you, which I so value. A while ago, tell me what year, and I'm just looking, was it 2016 that you first came out with your 2 books called Spare Me the Talk?
The boy book, the blue one, was in 2015, I think, and then the girl book came after.
Okay. So for those who don't have any idea what we're talking about, what are we talking about? What is the boy book and the girl book, and what are they all about?
So I work mostly with teenage boys, and so I had all this information, and I was doing talks for parents, and then a colleague of mine was like, "This is the book. You need to make this into a book," right? And at the time, there were no the sort of like puberty, growing up, relationships, safety, what's happening to my body books that were just for boys. There were ones for girls, there were ones for both. And so I said, okay, that's great. That sounds awesome. I kind of wanted to make it a one-stop shop with like everything that guys would need to know about navigating adolescence. All my books, I always put a section in the back. It's just for parents, and got really great feedback. People liked it, got, some nice attention. And then one of the biggest parts of the feedback that I got was like, you need to do a version of this for girls. And part of me was like, the girls have 800,000 books already, but okay, that's great. So I did kind of a mirrored option for girls. So the first book of that sort written for girls by a dude. So interesting perspective that I totally own. I had a fantastic armada of these like amazing women, everything from high school girls to college age women. I had some nurses, some therapists, moms, grandmas. Like I had it was like 13 of these women that met and like went through stuff and gave me feedback and made me make sure I wasn't sounding like a jerk because I totally wanted to own. I am a guy, but I've worked with teenage girls before, and like this is what I've learned in my journey. And so they just did a fantastic job. And that was a lot of fun to write as well. And so they've been out for a while, but the original publisher of it stopped being a publisher. So I got all the books back for myself and did a big expansive update that I'm super excited and proud of, and then have just redropped them with a different publisher.
I love it. So I want to talk about the update, but for those listeners who, you're not familiar with Jo's work or you haven't seen these books, first of all, there's pictures of the updated ones, links in the show notes, because if you have a tween or a teen or, someone in your life that is approaching that sort of puberty adolescent phase, you need this book. So I have both of them with me right now as we're talking. I've got the girl one because I happen to be raising girls. And well, first of all, I love that it comes from a trusted educator and that I can hand this book to my teenage daughter and know that the information that she's getting is accurate, that it is helpful, that she can learn from it, and that it's answering questions that, she might not want to necessarily talk in detail with me about, even if I could answer them. And Jo and I work in similar spaces, and Jo, I'm going to have you talk about each one of these just a little bit, but
okay.
There are really a bunch of different parts to the book. So it starts out going through biology and identity, and that's true for both the boy book and the girl book. So why did we start there? Why does the book start there? And does it still start there in the updated version, which I haven't yet gotten my hot little hands on, but I will.
It does. There's been some expansion, but no, I did start with that. I think for most people kind of seeking out that kind of book, especially the kids, that's sort of like the most salient thing. They're like, I've got weird hair in places now, or like what's happening to my body sort of thing. And so I think I wanted to just start with the basics of what is puberty, how does it work, pokey little puppy kind of thing, and just kind of start from there as the base and go.
Yeah. Here's what I would say. As you know, you and I agree 100% and are big advocates that parents should be talking to their kids and having all these conversations. And we also know that there are a lot of parents that feel really uncomfortable doing that because it wasn't done for them. So this is a great companion. Like, I don't want to let anyone off the hook here and say you don't have to have these conversations. You do. But this can be like a really great way to start the conversation, to continue the conversation. If it's something that you're super freaked out about doing, you can also call Jo or me if you need help doing that.
Anytime.
But okay, so we start there with the basics of puberty and biology and the stuff that, is pretty just factually established. And then it expands from there. And you talk about relationships and sexual health and sexual harm, online safety. As you said, there's a section for parents. Well, what I'd like to sort of start by asking, in addition to the content in there, as I just said, like, we're not letting parents off the hook. You still got to have these conversations. But when you were writing this, and when people were asking you to write this, what was sort of the big vision in terms of how parents would use it with their tweens or teens? And what role do they still play in having these conversations?
I mean, the role is huge, right? Like, I mean, you know me, we're aligned with that. There's no substitute for parents having conversations, right? The factors that are involved in that is the comfort level of both the kids and the parents. Most of the time, it's the parents that come to those talks with the baggage, right? That idea of like the awkward sex talk that I have with my kids. Like, most of that's the adults bringing that stuff into it. Kids, especially if you've been talking to them about stuff since they were little, it can just be kind of, part of those conversations that we just have with our kids. And to them, it's not always super awkward, until sometimes when it is. It's been fun with the book. I think I wrote it with the intention of, if you're a kid and your parents just couldn't go there, or if you were a parent and you just don't know what to say, you could read the book, use it as a springboard. Honestly, like, that's the joke of the title. Like, you could just give it to them and walk away. And if you trust me, I feel pretty good that they're going to get most of what they should be hearing. But I've had kids use it really in clever ways as well. Like, I've had several kids say that they wanted to talk to my parents about like this topic, whatever. So they like dog mark the page and just kind of leave it on the coffee table. And so the parents are like, what's this? Oh, this page is marked. Maybe I should go have a conversation about that with them, and sort of kind of backdoor their parents into conversations, which I think is terrific. A lot of parents tell me, they read the chapter about oral sex or sexually transmitted infections or something like that. And then they say, get in the car, let's go get some ice cream. Or they read it together with their kids. I sort of write how I speak. There's lots of humor in it, lots of kind of tongue in cheek stuff, but then also factual, respectful information.
Well, and that's one of the things I appreciate about it the most, is that it's not sort of this high and mighty intellectual text. Like, it's really accessible and really readable. My daughter I don't know if she's read every page, but she has read a lot of it, and we have lots of conversations, but my kid was one who just was comforted by having more knowledge about things that kind of gave her anxiety or still give her anxiety. She wanted information, and it was so nice to be like, okay, well, I'm not going to talk about it for hours a day, but I'll talk about it, but not for, but here's a great resource for you to, to get additional information, to hear about it from someone else's perspective, not just your mom's or your dad's. It's been a lovely tool. And I've always been an advocate, whether we're talking to 5-year-olds or 15-year-olds, about using books to springboard into conversations.
Yeah.
So talk to me about the expansion. Like, you got the book back from the publisher because they ceased being a publisher, which gave you a lot of freedom and leeway to do what you wanted with it. 5 years, or what is it? How many years later are we? 7 years later?
Yeah. Well, so there was expansions before that I kind of updated like the stats and that kind of thing, but it was pretty minimal. This one, I kind of did a deep dive. I was super excited to just have my own free reign to do what I wanted with it. And so these are the third editions of the books. And the thing that I'm most proud and excited about is just expanding the languaging, right? Because there was definitely like the boy book with the blue cover and the girl book with the pink cover that was sort of designed by the previous publisher. I kept those themes, but inside the books, like, the languaging is very expansive. So the boy book, talks a lot about like people with penises, if you happen to have testicles, if you identify as a boy, but you don't have a penis, like, or if you have a vagina, but you identify as a boy, these are some things that you need to pay attention to and know about as well. So I really took a lot of the bones of the books and kind of merged them together just to acknowledge and speak to the ways that those words have kind of changed by definition.
Yeah, that not everybody identifies on that strict binary.
Yeah. And the books always kind of felt pretty binary to me. And, in some ways, like they still can be, but if you happen to be someone who identifies as a girl, but you do have a penis. Like there's stuff for you still in the pink book for girls kind of thing that doesn't feel isolating.
Yeah. And I would like to just add in here for listeners that Jo has also written a phenomenal book called The Pride Guide, which it's a big, hefty book, but it is for those really for what you're describing. So if the boy book and the girl book of Spare Me the Talk don't give your tween or teen what they need, as Jo just said, there's a ton of extra content here, but if they need more because they do identify on that LGBTQ plus spectrum, the Pride Guide is phenomenal. And that's really, you talked about a lot of that in the Safe Parenting Summit for 2023. So want to make sure we'll put that in the show notes too, so that parents know that that's out there as a resource for both them and their teens.
Thank you. Yeah, same kind of vibe, just like what's happened in my body growing up, personal safety, all that kind of stuff, but specifically for kids who identify on those LGBT like spectrums specifically, because it really is, the conversation can be different in that situation. So,
okay. So in the expansion that, and right now when we're having this conversation, it's beginning of September, it's like just been out for a little over a month. Yeah. So listeners, if they get a copy, like they're getting it really hot off the presses. What else do you want people to know that has changed in that 7 or 8 years since you wrote the first one that you felt like really needed to be expanded on? Because not only is that important for purposes of the book, but it might also be informative for parents in terms of what are things that we're realizing they also need to be talking about now.
Well, it's really shocking. But if you think, like you said earlier, the first versions were 2015 and 2016, and the world is hell and gone from 2016 at this point. Like so much has happened, like on every level of civilization, right? And so there's things that Gen Z is facing that they just weren't acknowledged about. They're still not like kind of acknowledged in mainstream media sometimes even. But I wanted to speak really, in terms of personal safety, talking about overdoses, talking about, I have a whole chapter just on active shooter situations, because this is something that kids think about every single day. I have kids, who they say, I think about it every day. And now here we are going back to school, first day of school. Is this the last time I say goodbye to my parents? Is this the day one of my friends is going to die? Like it's in the ether and they're thinking about it a lot, right? And, one of the things that's changed since 2016, it's the leading cause of death for teenagers. Is like if a teenager dies in America, statistically, they're most likely going to die from a bullet. It used to be car accidents. Bullets have taken over, right? And so it's just something that I thought was important to acknowledge and talk about. Like, this is a reality that you have to deal with, and here's how you can handle it. And then in addition to that, there's a new section now about difficult feelings. So talking about anger management, talking about how to handling stress, anxiety, depression, panic attacks, self-harm, how to handle if you are thinking of hurting yourself, or if your friend tells you that they're thinking of hurting themselves, like how do you handle that? All that kind of stuff, I wanted to kind of put in this book, right? There's a section in there on fentanyl, because that's, a thing that we're dealing with now that we weren't in 2016.
I'm going to pause you right there, because you just touched on 3 really big things. I have to give an editorial side note as the host of this show, and people who've listened to me for any time know that I don't, hold back on my cussing when it's appropriate. So what the fuck? When are we as a culture and as a world going to say it's not okay that our kids' leading cause of death is gunshot wounds, right? Bullets,
right?
Not okay. That is not okay. Okay. Second side note, put a kid into that environment where they're thinking about that every day, not to mention everything else. And no wonder anxiety is through the roof.
Yeah. It was really interesting during quarantine, which, something else that's happened since 2016, depression went down for a lot of kids, but anxiety went through the roof.
Yeah.
Right.
True for adults too during that period.
Yeah, just being able to acknowledge that is a reality for kids, right? And then
Yeah.
we went back to in-person school, and then depression jumped up just like the anxiety again, like it was
Yeah.
before. But I'm convinced it's directly tied to like the gun culture in America. Like it's a mess. And a lot of kids in Gen Z, they don't have the experience that the grown-ups are gonna help them. Like
Yeah.
that they don't think anything's going to be done about it. And honestly, like the reality is probably that is true.
Yeah.
Right? They are the ones that are going to have to fix this. They're not going to have their hands on the steering wheel of this country for, another couple of decades. But they're paying attention in a way that generations their age have never done before.
Yeah.
Right? Gen Z is so aware and active with things in a way that just we've never done before, right? So I'm proud of them. I feel terrible for them. They're going to save us all. But yeah, their experiences that, that the adults are not going to help.
Oh
And
my
so
God. It's so true. I just finished listening to a book called Stolen Focus by a guy named Johann Hari, I think is his name. And he was talking about this and like the anxiety and the stress that all of us, but our teens in particular. And there's just some really interesting tie-ins with what you were just saying. And gun culture, of course, there's also a big tie-in to like the inability of our kids to go out and explore the world in the way that we all did when we were younger. So it just really interesting stuff. Okay. So you also mentioned the issue with fentanyl right now.
yes.
And I am so grateful that you mentioned this. Literally an hour before we recorded this conversation today, I was inside answering questions inside the Heartful Parent Academy for parents that are a member of that membership group. And there were questions about what are the conversations that we need to have with our kids as they start middle school or before they start middle school. And fentanyl is one of the things that I mentioned because a former colleague of mine at the prosecutor's office said to me, Christy, people need to be talking to their kids about fentanyl. So I am so glad that you put that in this book. This is no longer a book just about puberty and adolescence, but it's not just about the birds and the bees, so to speak. We're now getting into really big, heavy issues that are affecting these kids.
Yeah. And, my philosophy and my stance is about safety. Lots of things that happen in life, and we have to go at these things being as safe and smart as we can. And education is how you do both of those things. And so in terms of personal safety, I talk about drunk driving, or what if you're with someone who wants to drunk drive? Like, what does it look like? How can you tell if someone has overdosed on a drug or marijuana or whatever, right? And then fentanyl obviously is just everywhere in this insidious way. And so just giving kids a heads up, like, here are things in the world that you're going to have to encounter and think about, have a philosophy for, and navigate. And here's some ideas about how you might be able to do that, or at least the information that you need.
Yeah.
So that you can kind of make those choices or go talk to someone else about it and make a plan. Right?
Yeah. It's so important that parents and teens have awareness of those because, like drunk driving, some of these things like guns and fentanyl, like it's a one strike and you're out. Like you don't get a second chance all the time. Right. So I love that you've included it. But I haven't read the updated version, I have to confess. But what I have always loved about what I love in the Pride Guide and what I loved about the first version of this book is that it's not lectury, right? Like you're not lecturing the teens who are reading it. You're giving them information and tools.
I like to think of that as that way. I hope that comes across. That's my intention, right? And like I said, I work mostly with boys, so I really try to avoid like the big scrolling paragraphs and just have short bits of digestible information. Like a kid could just kind of open the book to any random page and have something jump out at them that is just sort of like a clear fact about an issue, maybe a little bit of snarky humor along with it, and something to think about.
Totally. So in the copy that I have, I just picked up the book, flipped to a random page. It took me to, you've got a chapter on here on HIV and AIDS 101. Side note, another editorial comment. So glad that you're talking about this still, because we know from the recent report that came out of the CDC earlier this year, which I did an episode on early on in the podcast, that the number of teens that are being tested or talking about STIs and the number of teens using contraception, like condoms, has gone down. So we still need to be talking about these things. But like I opened it up, it's 3 little paragraphs about, a special note about sexually transmitted infections. Or there's another paragraph or a little subsection about, medication, pre-exposure prophylaxis, like medication to prevent HIV. And all told, this chapter is only 4 pages long. So, it's not a treatise on HIV and AIDS, not meant to be, but so helpful to a teen who wants the Cliff Notes, right? Or the podcast version of what do I need to know and need to know now?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's what they want, right? They're not gonna read, 15 pages on sexually transmitted infections.
Right.
And I don't want them to.
The TikTok
like that would
video.
be exactly
writing,
right. Like
right? Yeah. It's the short. Here's the really critical, essential things you need to know, which I love. And frankly, as we all see our ability to read, I think many of us are noticing like a decrease in our ability to focus. This is so great because it's bolded. It's easy. Like, okay, what's the thing that applies to me right now? Or what can I touch on? All right. What else? What does the new version? Because some listeners may already have a copy of the old one. You've talked about a number of things that are added. What else is in there?
So one of the other things I'm super excited about the new version is that I've got this whole section in there about upstandering, right? And versus bystandering, and talking about things like hate crimes, how to avoid doing them, what do you do if you witness those things happening, and kind of talking about the kid version of like cancel culture, because it's so much easier for kids, if somebody does something that like is coloring outside the lines, like rather than just sort of like confronting them and talking about it, they're much more likely to just like post the crap on Instagram or something and say, hey, this person did this, and just kind of try to sort of shut that person down, slash sometimes ruin their lives for a while. And so talking about where is your line, where does it need to be in terms of how much damage you see being done to another human. When you see that kind of stuff, how do you handle that? Yes, you can go to social media and kind of call them out, but I talk also in the book about calling people in. Like, how do you reach out to people and say, you know what, this is not how we do things here in this family, in our school, in this community. And then, trying to talk to people in a reasoned way about malicious behavior.
Yeah.
And then when do you need to involve other people in the conversation, and just kind of taking time to sort of try to make some change, have a line in the sand that you're not willing to cross, holding other people accountable, but in a way that's not necessarily just sort of salting the earth with them, right? So yeah. I'm really excited about that section.
I'm excited about that too, because I think that's one of the things that many of us as adults don't know how to help our kids with. Again, we weren't necessarily taught how to be an upstander, and some listeners may not be familiar with that phrase, but it's the idea of like standing up and stepping in when something isn't right, as opposed to just being a bystander. And we weren't necessarily taught how to do that. We weren't necessarily taught, the politics in our culture is demonstrating this, that we're not great at calling people in instead of calling them out, right?
Yeah.
And so a book like this, information like this can be so helpful, I think, for not just our teens, but for us as parents to be like, oh, okay, that's how we can talk about this. And that's how we can support our kids. And maybe, just maybe, learn a little something ourselves in the process.
Yeah, I think if nothing else, like there's fuel in there for some really fantastic parent-child conversations. Even if, as a parent, like you got the book and you never even gave it to your kid, like you could just use it as your own springboard for having conversations as well. But with all this stuff in there, I really think even beyond, like you said, like middle school and high school, my son's going off to college and I'm going to put a copy of it in his backpack on his way out the door,
yes,
just so that he has it, right? There's stuff in there that is, I say 12 to 22, right? Like the kids are going to need to maybe look back, reference, remind themselves, do a tune-up on, that kind of stuff.
I mean, for your son, of course, getting a copy of the book in his backpack, it's like a love note from his own dad. But I can But I can really see that we all as parents could give something like this, or this specifically, to our 12 to 22-year-olds as I love you. You need this information. I'm just so grateful that it's out there. I have a little bit of a book addiction. So as soon as we end this conversation, I can tell you I'm getting a copy of the updated one to make sure that my daughter has that, because she's a, newly minted high schooler and needs some of these skills. In writing the update, Jo, what, if you could narrow it down, like what were your big 3 sort of ahas as you were exploring these new subjects that you wanted to dig into for kids and their parents?
I think the conversation around like to cancel or not to cancel somebody and how to do that, I think was really exciting to me. My kids too, I said, like, at some point, we're all going to be tasked with that. Like, we're all going to be in a Starbucks and some jackass is going to be saying something terrible to a woman or a person of color or something. And like, it is our job as human creatures that share the planet with each other to like step in and say something. And not just like stand by and watch that stuff happen, or whip out your phone and video it, which is what most people, especially kids, will do, right? And studies show it just takes that one person to step in and say something, and then other people will follow suit, but most people aren't going to do it until someone else does. Yeah. And so shooting to be that person is a big value of mine that I wanted to really kind of pass on in the book as well. And then the inclusive languaging, you know what I mean? I think the boy and girl, it's just so limiting, especially to this generation's eyes. So I wanted to really just be kind of clear, yes, this is a book for boys, but what that means can have lots of different meanings that I wanted to kind of honor and reach out to all of those permutations. And then the emotional part, I think, because we've all been traumatized in different ways, into different degrees over the last half a dozen years. Like it's been a rough decade. Yeah. And so I really just wanted to say, like, how do you notice these feelings? How do you put a name to these feelings? What do you do about them? And how do you help other people deal with theirs as well? Yeah. That was really a deep layer of the book that needed to happen.
Those 3 things alone seem like not just important for the readers, but kind of a gift in the process of writing for you and for all of your clients. So, with those kind of 3 things in mind, I think it's a great time to kind of wrap things up. We will obviously put links to all of this in the show notes for everyone who is listening. Again, the book is called Spare Me the Talk, a growing up safe and smart guide for boy or girl identified people and their parents. It's by Jo. Really, it's a must-have for anyone with a kiddo of any gender from ages 12 to 22. Jo, thank you for putting this out into the world and for supporting parents, because there aren't enough resources like this out. And as you said, the last decade has been rough. It is a rough time to be parenting. It's a rough time to be a teen or adolescent. And the more sort of common sense, humorous support we can get, the better.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for being here.
Anytime.
Oh, Heartful Parents, thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Heartful Parent Podcast. As always, I'm really glad that you are here. The show notes for today's episode are chock full of resources. So obviously Jo's book and the links to those books will be there, as well as the Pride Guide. We'll make sure that you know how to find that. As you heard me talk about during the course of the interview, when we were talking about fentanyl, I shared with you that I was answering questions about that just today inside the Heartful Parent Academy, which is a phenomenal course, program, support group, you name it, that is licensed and certified by the Positive Discipline Association and gives you infinite parenting resources and information from yours truly. So if that sounds like something of interest, whether you're parenting a toddler or a teen, that one is for you. And there is a link to join in the show notes for only $7 for your first month. I would love to see you in there. With that, I will just sort of wrap this conversation up by noting that since the time yesterday that I recorded the conversation with Jo, I was actually able to get my hands on a copy of the updated and revised book, and it is fabulous. I hope that if you've got a kiddo or anyone in your life within that 12 to 22 age range, you got to get a copy of this book and give it to them. It is nothing short of an act of love. It's heartful parenting at its finest. All right, with that, I hope you have a fabulous week. I'm signing off, and I'll see you next week for another great episode of the Heartful Parent Podcast. Cheers.